In the winter of 1968, 12 American soldiers boarded a helicopter in the mountains of Laos. They carried no identification. They wore no insignia. Their mission had no name, only a number. Black File 17. Within 72 hours, every single one of them would vanish from the face of the earth. No bodies. No reiki. No distress signal. Just silence. The Pentagon denied they ever existed. Their families were told they died in training. Accidents, thousands of miles from where they actually disappeared. For decades, their names appeared on no memorial, their sacrifice acknowledged by no one. But documents don't stay buried forever. And the truth, no matter how deeply it's classified, has a way of surfacing. Tonight, we peel back 5 decades of secrecy to reveal what really happened to the men of Black File 17. This is the story of a mission so sensitive the government erased it from history, and the soldiers who paid the ultimate price for operations their own country refuses to admit ever happened. To understand what happened to the men of Black File 17, you first have to understand a war within a war, one that the American public wasn't supposed to know existed. By 1968, the Vietnam War had become a quagmire. American forces were locked in a brutal struggle against the Viet Cong and North Vietnamese army. But the real battle, the Shadow War, was being fought in places that didn't officially exist on any military map. Laos, Cambodia, the border regions of North Vietnam. These were neutral countries. The United States had publicly committed to respecting their sovereignty. Officially, no American combat troops operated there. But officially and actually are two very different things. The Military Assistance Command Vietnam Studies and Observations Group, known simply as MACV-SOG, was the most classified unit of the entire Vietnam War. They ran missions so secret that even most military commanders didn't know they existed. Their operations were given numerical designations, filed in black folders, and locked away in safes accessible only to a handful of people. Black File 17 was one of these operations. The men selected for these missions were volunteers, handpicked from Special Forces, Navy SEALs, Marine Force Recon, and Army Rangers. They underwent additional training, so intensive that many washed out. Those who remained became what insiders called ghost soldiers. They operated beyond the reach of conventional military support. If captured, the United States government would deny their existence. If killed, their deaths would be attributed to accidents or illnesses far from the actual locations where they fell. The 12 men assigned to Black File 17 knew these risks. They accepted them anyway. The team was led by Captain Marcus Holloway, a 31-year-old Green Beret from rural Georgia who had already completed 4 previous cross-border operations. His second-in-command was Staff Sergeant William "Red" Patterson, a former Marine with a reputation for keeping his men alive in impossible situations. The rest of the team consisted of communications specialists, demolitions experts, indigenous interpreters, and reconnaissance specialists. They had trained together for 6 weeks, running simulations in the Philippine jungle designed to replicate their target area. By all accounts, they were one of the most capable teams MACV-SOG had ever assembled. Their mission was designated Operation Prairie Fire 17, internally called Black File 17. The objective was both simple and extraordinarily dangerous: infiltrate a heavily defended region of the Ho Chi Minh Trail in Laos, gather intelligence on a suspected North Vietnamese army staging area, and extract without detection. The intel suggested that the NVA was massing forces for what would later become known as the Tet Offensive. Command needed eyes on the ground to confirm troop numbers, equipment, and movement timelines. On February 2, 1968, at approximately 0400 hours, Captain Holloway and his team lifted off from a classified forward operating base. They were inserted by helicopter into a landing zone deep in Laotian territory, a place that, according to official U.S. policy, American soldiers had never been. Their last confirmed radio contact came 7 hours later. After that, nothing. When a reconnaissance team misses a scheduled radio check, protocol dictates an immediate escalation. Search and rescue assets are placed on standby. Backup teams are briefed. Air support is coordinated. But Black File 17 was different, because the mission took place in a country where American forces weren't supposed to be. Operating, the normal response protocols didn't apply. Rescue operations required authorization that climbed all the way to the White House. And in February 1968, the White House had other concerns. The Tet Offensive began on January 30th, just 3 days before Captain Holloway's team was inserted. Major cities across South Vietnam were under siege. American military and political leadership were consumed by a crisis that would fundamentally change the trajectory of the war. The disappearance of 12 men in Laos barely registered. Initial after-action reports, most of which remained classified until 2003, paint a picture of bureaucratic paralysis. Requests for aerial reconnaissance of the team's last known position were delayed for 48 hours. By the time aircraft were finally dispatched, monsoon weather had moved in, making visual confirmation impossible. Ground recovery operations were proposed but never authorized. The political risk of having American soldiers captured or killed in Laos, especially during the chaos of Tet, was deemed unacceptable. In the clinical language of military intelligence, Black File 17 was reclassified from mission in progress to personnel unaccounted for. For the families of these 12 men, the nightmare was just beginning. Martha Holloway received a telegram on February 19, 1968, informing her that her husband had died in a helicopter accident during a training exercise in South Vietnam. No remains were recovered, she was told, because the aircraft had crashed into the ocean. There was no helicopter crash. There was no ocean. Similar notifications went to the families of all 12 team members. Each story was slightly different: training accidents, vehicle collisions, medical emergencies, but all shared one common element. They were lies. The deception was deliberate and systematic. Government officials visited families, expressed condolences, answered questions with rehearsed responses, and ensured that no one looked too closely at the official narrative. For most families, the grief was compounded by nagging doubts. Details didn't add up. Letters from their loved ones had mentioned assignments that contradicted the official stories. Some families compared notes and discovered discrepancies that suggested a coordinated cover-up. But in 1968, challenging the government's account of a soldier's death was nearly impossible. There was no internet. Classified documents remained locked away. Families who asked too many questions were politely but firmly discouraged from pursuing their inquiries. The men of Black File 17 became what one researcher later called officially dead, actually vanished, casualties not of enemy action, but of deniability. For nearly 3 decades, the fate of Black File 17 remained buried in classified archives. The families mourned, the files gathered dust, and the truth seemed destined to remain hidden forever. That changed in 1993. Following the collapse of the Soviet Union, a wave of declassification swept through American intelligence agencies. Documents related to Cold War operations, including many MACV-SOG missions, were reviewed for potential release. Among them were fragments of the Black File 17 dossier. The initial release was heavily redacted, entire pages blacked out, names obscured, locations vaguely referenced. But it was enough to confirm what some researchers had long suspected. There had been a mission, it had taken place in Laos, and the men involved had never been recovered. The revelation sparked renewed interest from several quarters. Veterans advocacy groups demanded answers. Investigative journalists began filing Freedom of Information Act requests. And most importantly, families who had spent 25 years wondering what really happened to their loved ones finally had something tangible to hold on to. Leading the effort was Sarah Holloway Bennett, Captain Marcus Holloway's daughter. She had been just 4 years old when her father disappeared. She had grown up with the official story, the helicopter crash, the lost remains, the training exercise that never was. Now, armed with partially declassified documents, she began piecing together what actually happened. Her investigation took years. She interviewed surviving MACV-SOG veterans, many of whom spoke publicly about their experiences for the first time. She traveled to Vietnam and Laos, working with local researchers to access records from the other side of the conflict. She filed dozens of FOIA requests, fought government agencies in court, and refused to accept redacted answers when she believed more information existed. What she eventually discovered painted a tragic but coherent picture. Captain Holloway's team had successfully infiltrated their target area. They had established an observation position overlooking a major North Vietnamese supply route. For approximately 18 hours, they had gathered invaluable intelligence that, according to some analysts, could have provided critical advance warning of the Tet
Offensive scope.
But they had been compromised. Intercepted North Vietnamese communications, obtained decades later through international research cooperation, revealed that the team's position had been detected by enemy reconnaissance elements on the evening of February 3rd. A battalion-sized force was dispatched to encircle and eliminate them. The last radio transmission from Black File 17, received at 1847 hours on February 3rd, was a brief emergency signal indicating contact with hostile forces. No further communication was ever recorded. Evidence suggests that Captain Holloway's team fought a desperate delaying action, attempting to reach an emergency extraction point approximately 3 kilometers from their observation post. Whether any of them made it that far remains unclear. North Vietnamese records, imperfect though they are, make reference to an engagement with American commandos in the general area during the relevant time frame. Captured equipment mentioned in these records is consistent with gear known to be used by MACV-SOG teams, but no remains have ever been recovered. No survivors ever emerged from captivity. No definitive proof of what happened in those final hours has ever been found. The men of Black File 17 simply vanished into the jungle, their fate known only to the enemies they were fighting and to a government that chose to pretend they never existed. By the early 2000s, mounting evidence and sustained public pressure had made continued denial increasingly untenable. In 2008, the Department of Defense officially reclassified the 12 members of Black File 17 as killed in action, 40 years after they disappeared. It was a small victory, but a meaningful one. For Sarah Holloway Bennett and the other families, the reclassification represented something more than bureaucratic acknowledgement. It meant that their fathers, brothers, and husbands were finally being recognized as the warriors they were, not victims of training accidents, but casualties of secret combat operations conducted in service to their country. In 2012, a private memorial was dedicated at a Special Forces training facility in North Carolina. The names of all 12 men were inscribed on a stone marker. Veterans who had served alongside them in MACV-SOG attended, some sharing stories publicly for the first time. But the reckoning extended beyond memorial services and official acknowledgments. The case of Black File 17 forced a broader examination of how the United States government treats its most classified warriors and their families in the aftermath of tragedy. These were men who volunteered for the most dangerous assignments imaginable. They accepted that they might die in places their country would never admit sending them. But they trusted that their sacrifice would eventually be honored. Their families eventually told the truth. That trust was betrayed for decades. The systematic deception practiced against the families of Black File 17 and countless other classified casualties raises profound questions about the relationship between secrecy and democracy. When does operational security become a cover for avoiding accountability? When does protecting sources and methods become an excuse for abandoning the families of those who made the ultimate sacrifice? These questions have no easy answers. Covert operations remain essential to national security. Some secrets genuinely must be kept. The men who conduct these missions understand the risks better than anyone. But the case of Black File 17 suggests that the balance between secrecy and humanity was lost, that the government's instinct for classification overwhelmed its obligation to the families of the fallen. Veterans of MACV-SOG and similar units have spent decades advocating for change. They've pushed for clearer policies on how long classification can be maintained before families are informed of the truth. They've argued for better support systems for the survivors of classified casualties. They've demanded that the contributions of covert operators be recognized, even if the specific details of their missions remain sensitive. Progress has been slow, but it has been real. Today, the families of special operations personnel killed in classified missions receive more information more quickly than they did in the 1960s. Counseling services have been expanded. Declassification timelines have been shortened. The culture of absolute denial has been, if not eliminated, at least substantially modified. These changes came too late for the families of Black File 17, but they represent a legacy, determination that future generations of classified warriors will not suffer the same abandonment. To this day, the jungle of Laos keeps its secrets. Despite decades of effort by the Defense POW MIA Accounting Agency and its predecessor organizations, the remains of Captain Marcus Holloway and the 11 men who served with him have never been recovered. Excavation teams have searched the areas identified through research, but the dense vegetation, difficult terrain, and passage of time have conspired against definitive discovery. Some researchers believe the team's final position was destroyed by aerial bombardment during subsequent operations, American aircraft unknowingly obliterating any evidence of what happened. Others theorize that the men were captured alive, dying later in captivity, without their presence ever being acknowledged. A few hold out hope that remains might still be found, waiting somewhere in the forest for the archaeological techniques that might one day bring them home. The truth is, we may never know exactly what happened in those final hours. What we do know is this: 12 American soldiers walked into the jungle on a mission their country would not acknowledge, fought an enemy their government would not admit they encountered, and died in a place that officially did not exist. For 30 years, they were statistics hidden in classified folders. For 4 decades, their families lived with lies. For half a century, their sacrifice went unhonored. They deserve better. The men of Black File 17 were not seeking glory. They knew their missions would never make headlines, their victories never celebrated in public. They served in shadow because that's where their country needed them, accepting the risks, trusting that their service mattered, believing that their sacrifice would be remembered. We remember them now, not as abstractions or file numbers, not as redacted names in declassified documents, but as soldiers, as warriors, as Americans who gave everything, asking nothing in return except the truth. Captain Marcus Holloway, Staff Sergeant William Patterson, and 10 other men whose full story may never be told. They were sent on a mission that vanished, but they themselves should never be forgotten.